Good afternoon. Thank you for joining for Edges of the Imagination, Surrealism in Mexico City and New York City. I'm Julia Erdesi, and I work in learning and engagement. I'll begin with a land acknowledgement. The Philadelphia Art Museum recognizes Philadelphia as part of Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral homelands of the Lenape peoples. A long history of broken treaties, forced migrations, and fraudulent agreements, such as the walking purchase of 1737, displaced many of the Lenape from this land. This museum and our staff strive to understand our place within the legacy of colonization and to act as allies to Lenape people and their vibrant communities today, including the federally recognized nations, Delaware Tribe, Delaware Nation, and the Stockbridge-Munsee community. We pay honor and respect to Lenape ancestors, past and present, by committing to build a more inclusive and equitable space for all. This program is the 38th Behrend Lecture. Rose Susan Hirshhorn Behrend was a guide at the Philadelphia Art Museum for 39 years, and her passion for learning and sharing that knowledge with the general public led her family to establish this annual lecture series in her honor in 1997. Since then, the fund has supported learning about the museum's collection and exhibitions with incredible talks by such luminaries as art historians Lisa Farrington and Nancy Princenthal, and artists such as Joseph Kosuth and Patti Smith. We are grateful to the Behrend family for their support and thrilled to continue this tradition today. And now some brief introductions. Matthew Affron is the Muriel and Philip Berman Curator of Modern Art at the Philadelphia Art Museum and the curator of Dreamworld, Surrealism at 100 in Philadelphia. Tere Arcq is an art historian and curator, and she is a former chief curator of the Museo de Arte Moderno in Mexico City. Her exhibitions and publications focus on surrealism in Mexico, especially on women artists, often through the lens of mysticism and the occult. Louis Kachur authored Displaying the Marvelous, Marcel Duchamp, Salvador Dalí, and Surrealist exhibition installations from MIT Press in 2001. He is currently writing a book on installation art in New York museums. And Mark Polizzotti directs the publications program at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. His books include Revolution of the Mind, The Life of André Breton, Highway 61 Revisited, Sympathy for the Traitor, a Translation Manifesto, Why Surrealism Matters, and Jump Cuts, essays on surrealism, film, music, culture, and other utopian topics. I have just a few notes before I hand things over. Please silence cell phones. The program will last about an hour. Matthew and each panelist will present, and then Matthew will moderate discussion. There will be Q&A at the end. We will pass mics so that everyone in the room can hear your questions. We are happy to take questions from our virtual audience as well. My colleague Linnea in the back of the auditorium is monitoring the webinar and can read questions out loud on behalf of our Zoom participants. And now, please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Wonderful to see everyone here today, and also those who we can't see who are participating online. Welcome. Thank you, Julia. I'm Matthew Affron. I work at the museum as curator of modern art, and I organized the exhibition on surrealism that's on view at the museum through February 16th. Tell all your friends. I'm going to try to be brief so we can move on to our three distinguished panelists' presentations and the conversations that will follow. We have been delighted to partner with the Pompidou Center in Paris and 3 other European museums, the Royal Museum of Fine Arts in Brussels, the Mapfre Foundation in Madrid, and the Hamburger Kunsthalle, in developing a series of linked exhibitions that told the story of Surrealist art. Philadelphia is the final stop and the only venue in the United States. So why Philadelphia? The short answer is that our museum has a deep history with the topic through its distinguished collection of Surrealist art. And we're very proud to say that you will see across the street in the Dorrance galleries, if you have an opportunity to look at the exhibition, that a very large proportion of the checklist is works from our museum, which we don't see all the time on the walls. So it's really an opportunity, a very special one for us and for our audiences. The exhibition's subtitle, Surrealism at 100, points to an event that happened a century ago. What we're celebrating is, in the most precise sense, the centennial of the document that codified Surrealism as a movement in modern literature and modern art, but even more as a rebellious philosophy of life. The Surrealism Manifesto, published in 1924 in Paris by the French writer André Breton. Mark Polizzotti, our first speaker, will have more to say about the manifesto and about Surrealism's emergence at a time of great intellectual, cultural, and social commotion in Paris after World War I. Alongside poetry and other sorts of literature, visual art was the principal vehicle for the expression of Surrealist ideas from the start. Our exhibition tells the story of Surrealist art from the beginning to roughly 1960. My colleagues at the museum put together this story on the walls with 3 major goals in mind. We wanted to assemble a compelling list of great works by a broad roster of artists who were associated with the movement. We wanted to highlight the great panoply of innovative methods and techniques that one finds within Surrealist art and provide an opportunity for close looking. And we wanted to connect the dots in a story that is too vast for any single exhibition to tell completely. Chronologically, and the exhibition goes from the beginning of the story to around 1960, and thematically with 6 sections that deal with what I defined as major themes that go across the board in Surrealist art. One section of the show, which basically covers the 1940s, is unique to the Philadelphia version. It follows members of the Surrealist group who chose exile at the start of World War II in Europe and escaped to North America. And I mean Mexico and the US, and especially Mexico City and New York City. Our other panelists, Tere Arcq and Louis Kachur, will have more to say about that important turning point today. And now I will make way for our first speaker, Mark Polizzotti. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Matthew. Good afternoon, everyone. So, the topic of today's presentation is Mexico City and New York, which means I'm going to talk to you about Paris. Like many significant historical moments, the birth of Surrealism in Paris appears both accidental and inevitable. Accidental because 2 main driving forces of its gestation, the First World War and the advent of Freudian psychoanalysis, affected a great many European nations. So why was it a cluster of Parisian poets who launched the movement? Inevitable because Paris had long been a cauldron of aesthetic and philosophic ferment. Artistic revolutions like Impressionism and Cubism had their origins there. Experimental artists, writers, and freethinkers of all stripes and all nations flocked to Paris to soak in the atmosphere, take inspiration, exchange ideas, and revel in the social and aesthetic tolerance provided by the city's progressive populations. It was an exciting place to be. There we go. It was also an explosive place to be. Both literally, the late 19th century saw a wave of anarchist bombings in the city, and figuratively, as the arts waged their own war against the precarious cultural order. In 1913 alone, Paris witnessed Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, the first metaphysical paintings by Giorgio de Chirico, the development of synthetic cubism by Picasso, Gris, and Braque, and the publication of Proust's Swann's Way, Guillaume Apollinaire's Alcool, and Blaise Cendrar's The Prose of the Trans-Siberian, an epic poem that wedded the new, technologically induced love of speed with the visual innovation of collage. André Breton, Surrealism's founder and prime theorist, later pointed to 1913 as the year when his own artistic likes and dislikes first emerged, and he was far from alone. It was in that context that the future Surrealists came of age. But it was not only about Paris's cultural offerings. The city itself, its architecture, its aura, would become a primary source of inspiration for the movement's artists and writers. Often Breton and his friends could be found covering the lost byways of Paris, flea markets, working-class cinemas, out-of-the-way parks, such as the Butte Chaumont with its so-called Suicide's Bridge, probing the city like topological psychoanalysts. Despite the internationalism to which Surrealism can rightly lay claim, Paris remains first among equals in the history of the movement, reminiscent of Saul Steinberg's famous New Yorker cover of The World Viewed from Manhattan's West Side. Half a century earlier, the Surrealists had even created their own version of this map, the eerily prescient World in the Time of the Surrealists from 1929, in which Russia had taken over Eastern Europe and Western Europe is occupied by Germany, its capital being, of course, Paris. If Paris retains its pride of place, it's not merely out of cultural self-reference. For many Surrealists of all nationalities, the city and its secret corners, of which there were many more a century ago, abounded in discoveries and delights, favoring explorations that often assumed the character of dreams. In the automatic poem Sunflower from 1923, Breton conjures a farm that prospered in the heart of Paris. He later credited that poem with having presaged his meeting 11 years later with the artist Jacqueline Lombard, whom he married soon afterward, and their amorous midnight stroll through the produce markets of Les Halles, the farm in Paris. Louis Aragon, one of the capital's most assiduous walkers, in the aptly named Paris Peasant, takes the reader on an exploration of the city's covered arcades, transforming their tawdry storefronts into palaces of wonder. Others, like Philippe Soupeau in Last Nights of Paris, have left breadcrumb trails of their perambulations throughout the French capital in search of the arresting and the arousing. And no doubt the most famous prose work to come out of Surrealism, Breton's Nadja, is as much about Paris's hidden marvels, the petrifying coincidences available to anyone with eyes open enough to see, as it is about the author's encounter with its eponymous heroine. One reason Paris remains the locus classicus of Surrealism is that the Surrealists were so intent on transforming the city into something other than itself. Their aim was to make the familiar unsettling, uncanny, to create a foreign country out of what they saw every day. In 1933, the group launched a survey on certain possibilities of irrationally beautifying a city, asking whether one should preserve, displace, modify, transform, or remove certain Paris monuments. The answers, ranging from cover it in manure and blow it up, to replace it with a can of asparagus, might seem frivolous. But behind the humor lies a desire to reinvent the cityscape, infuse it with an eroticism and an excitement all its own. Beneath the paving stones, the dream. And if all this seems quixotic, consider current initiatives to reinvent and revivify urban spaces, or debates over whether public monuments deemed offensive should be replaced, and with what? Maybe a can of asparagus. In June 1940, Paris fell to the Germans. Surrealist writings were banned by the occupation censors, in the same way that its art had already been labeled degenerate, and the collaborationist press began pointing its finger at Surrealism as a major cause of France's military defeat. As Breton later told an interviewer, the immediate prospects were quite alarming. By that fall, he, Jacqueline, and their daughter Aube had made their way to Marseille, intent, like so many others then crowding in, on getting out. When Breton arrived in New York, he left behind him a place that was not just home, but first and foremost, his psychological, philosophical, and emotional base of operations. Years before, he had remarked that life abroad struck him as artificial, like a stage set. In swapping the inspirational mysteries of the City of Lights for the hurly-burly of the city that never sleeps, he must have known that the revolution he had waged for the past 2 decades would have to start afresh on new and very different grounds. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Today, we examine Surrealism as a global phenomenon that found a significant and transformative ground in Mexico. André Breton famously called Mexico the Surrealist country par excellence, a place where reality and myth were inextricably linked. In Mexico, Surrealism provided a unique space where women played a central and decisive role, transitioning from the movement's collective dictates toward a profoundly personal artistic language. Here, they synthesized the magical, mystical, and esoteric traditions discovered in Mexico into a revolutionary exploration of inner consciousness. Moving beyond the traditional role of the muse, they created a distinct visionary body of work that redefined their own creative boundaries. To understand this transformation, we must trace how Surrealism reached Mexico through 3 distinct communicating vessels. First, the intellectual path. This was forged by Los Contemporáneos, both a seminal magazine and an avant-garde group of writers and artists. They positioned themselves as a vital alternative to the era's dominant nationalist and ideological art, specifically opposing the dogmas of muralism. Since 1928, they had been commenting on Surrealist texts and works, including a brief translation of the manifesto, referring to the movement as suprarrealismo. A landmark moment in Mexico was the publication of the Surrealist map, which provocatively enlarged our country. Second, the path of the intermediaries, that it's artists like Miguel Covarrubias, Rosa Rolanda, and Agustín Lasso, among others, that lived in Paris during the movement's peak. Rolanda learned radiography from Man Ray, while Lasso returned to produce collages inspired by Max Ernst, importing a new syntax to the local context. Third, the path of the travelers. In 1936, the French poet Antonin Artaud arrived seeking to escape Western rationalism. He was fascinated by the Tarahumara culture and by artist Maria Izquierdo, stating that her painting possessed a truly Indian inspiration. In 1938, André Breton arrived. His primary objective was political, to prepare the manifesto for an independent revolutionary art with Leon Trotsky. Although co-written by the two, the document was signed by Diego Rivera to safeguard Trotsky's status in exile. During the visit, Breton was profoundly impressed by Frida Kahlo, meeting her as she was finishing her painting, What the Water Gave Me. Recognizing her singular vision, Breton helped her organize her first solo show at the Julian Levy Gallery in New York later that year. The year 1940 marked a definitive turning point with the International Exhibition of Surrealism at the Galería de Arte Mexicano. Curated by Wolfgang Palen and Cesar Moro with Breton at the distance, the show was meticulously structured into 3 symbolic sections: an international wing, a section for ancient and folk art, featuring pre-Columbian pieces from Rivera and Palen's private collections, and a dedicated Mexican section. The structure was critical, it juxtaposed modern European subversion with Mexico's mythic ancestral past. The local artists included were not the official muralists, with the exception of Rivera, who created a work with so-called Surrealist influence specifically for the show, but rather those of the subjective line, figures like Agustín Lasso, Julio Castañeda, and Ricardo Montenegro. However, Breton's friends, Manuel Álvarez Bravo, Rivera, and Kahlo, infiltrated the international section. Frida, with two monumental works, the two Fridas and La Mesa Herida, the Wounded Table, proving that women were beginning to claim their own monumental space within the Surrealist imaginary. With the outbreak of war in Europe, Mexico became a sanctuary for exiles. Three distinct but porous circles formed. In San Ángel, in the south of the city, around Alice Raon and Wolfgang Palen, a group formed with a social and archaeological character, deeply integrated with the local cultural elite, including Kahlo, Rivera, Rolanda, and Covarrubias. In Erongarícuaro, in Michoacán, Gordon Oslo Ford established an artistic and theoretical center. It was a site of constant exchange with visiting artists like Esteban Francés, Remedios Varo, and Palen. These debates led to the creation of Din, an influential magazine edited by Palen that documented a dissident surrealism merging art, science, and Amerindian cultures. And in Colonia San Rafael, the Alchemical Circle was born, featuring Varo, Carrington, Cathy Horna, among others. This neighborhood became the heart of a domestic laboratory where shared meals, tarot readings, and metaphysical discussions dissolved the boundaries between life and art, an atmosphere later immortalized by Gunter Gerso in his painting Los Días de la Calle Gabino Barreda. Many in these groups shared a profound fascination with Mexico's ancestral cultures and their magical belief systems. Their existing interest in the fourth dimension and the teachings of Peter Uspensky and George Gurdjieff intensified in Mexico due to a unique confluence of diverse esoteric groups, turning their exile into a collective lab for spiritual and artistic experimentation. In Mexico, women like Carrington and Varo achieved a state of individualization. They built a utopia of the interior, transforming domestic spaces into sites of metaphysical power. This is embodied in some of the works in the show. Leonora Carrington's Les Distractions de Dagobert stands as a testament to this period of mythic exploration, where she utilized Renaissance techniques to map a complex, stratified inner world. In Remedios Varo, Creation of the Birds, the artist is presented as an alchemist science, using music and starlight to bring life to the canvas. It is the ultimate statement of the woman artist as an autonomous creator, synthesizing the esoteric knowledge found in Mexico with a rigorous technical precision. Today, these artists are recognized not as companions, but as the architects of a unique visionary surrealism. By merging ancient myths with an exploration of inner consciousness, their work transcends its Parisian origins. Their legacy remains a profound revolution of the mind, a validation of the spiritual and the esoteric as vital forms of knowledge that continue to re-enchant our understanding of art today. Thank you.
So, now New York, if Philadelphia doesn't mind. Nobody did more to bring surrealism to New York than this couple, Salvador and Gala Dalí, who, seen here on an ocean liner, is quite symbolic of their transit across the Atlantic 3 times in the 1930s. Doesn't seem like much, but in fact, No other central members of the Parisian Surrealist group made that trip before the outbreak of World War II. Dalí saw, I think, New York as a place to propagate himself as the main figure of Surrealism, the face of Surrealism, as it were, and to bring his work to public and collectors' attention. The whole story starts in the summer of 1931 when Julian Levy, a collector, buys this famous painting from a Paris gallery where it had remained unsold. He brings it to New York. Levy opens a gallery in November of 1931, and by January 1932, puts on show the first first New York exhibition surveying Surrealism, over 40 works, numerous artists. Which one does the New York Times choose to reproduce as symbolizing Surrealism? Of course, the famous persistence of memory. Within a short time, it's sold to a New York collector. A couple years later, donates it to the Museum of Modern Art, where it remains a gem and touchstone of the modern art collection and Surrealism collection. The first painting by Dalí to enter that collection. At the same time, an unknown artist called Joseph Cornell buttonholes Julian Levy and manages to negotiate his way into the exhibition, that first Surrealist exhibition in New York, with the 27, the glass bell, and also the commission to create this charming catalog cover of the young man trumpeting Surrealism in French to the American audience. Cornell shows himself in the glass bell that he shows at that show, shows himself very up to date on the latest theories of the Surrealist object as propounded by no less than Salvador Dalí and his shoe fetish ready-made, with a number of small shoes in Cornell, making an allusion to that by including a little woman's shoe in the glass bell object as a kind of shout out and wink to Dalí. Cornell gets skin in the game with Dalí's exhibitions in 33 and 34 at Levy Gallery by actually buying a painting, even though he was of modest means, buying the painting of the grasshopper child that you see on the left, and that is, interestingly, an image of childhood and not an image of adult sexuality. By the third show at Levy Gallery, Dalí makes his second trip to New York, and one that's very much planned to coincide with the Museum of Modern Art's huge survey, Fantastic Art Data Surrealism. At the same moment, Dalí plans another show at Levy, and he also creates a vitrine for Bonwit's fashion store so that the man on the street can experience Surrealism just passing the vitrine, and also includes a work that's in the show, the white aphrodisiac telephone or lobster telephone that is one of the Surrealist woman's accoutrements. When Time magazine reviews this show and the Surrealist moment in fashion in New York, no less than Dalí himself symbolizes the whole enterprise. Quite amazing for an artist to be on the cover of Time magazine instead of politicians and businessmen. Also quite amazing to have a Surrealist photograph heavily shadowed by Man Ray to accomplish that task of literally making Dalí the face of Surrealism for the American audience. So what to do to top that? For his third visit to New York, Dalí takes on a commission to design a pavilion for the New York World's Fair, pretty ambitious. Also another Bonwitz window, also another Levy exhibition. This kind of trifecta, public and private, comes to an unhappier end this time because one of the Bonwitz employees altered Dalí's display when they were setting it up after Dalí had gone away for a break. Dalí became enraged, charged into the window, tipped over the bathtub that was part of the display, and actually crashed it through the vitrine window of Bonwitz, and Dalí came tumbling after. This made the tabloids, but also is an interesting moment of evidence from the artist Peter Busa that he and his friend Jackson Pollock were going to Midtown just to see Dalí's new window on opening day. So there's the interest in what's Dalí doing now unexpectedly on the part of Jackson Pollock. Pollock no doubt also went to Dalí's exhibition that opened 5 days later nearby, the window fracas, and Levy said that despite the charge of mischief levied against Dalí, the paintings sold like hotcakes, and the show was very popular. So we imagine Jackson Pollock again coming to the scene and viewing Dalí's new wrinkle in Surrealist theory, not the double image, but the multiple image. As illustrated in the catalog, 6 images within this painting called the Endless Enigma. So you can keep seeing things in the picture, including figurative motifs and also animal motifs, multiple figures and multiple animals that Dalí lays out in a kind of do-it-yourself design, graphic design, showing each of the images separately in the margin. I think Pollock paid attention to this. His contemporary drawings show fusions of animal and human, especially the one on contemporary is the one on the left, the fusion of horse head, human head, bird's beak. Very frenetic and aggressive, calmer image of the same kind of experimentation 3 years later of the couple, which provides the 4 legs of the standing beast and how they share their human and animal bodies. This drawing was done at the same time as Pollock's famous painting, She-Wolf, which was one of the stars of his first show, one-man show at Peggy Guggenheim Gallery. And having read all of Dalí's theory about the multiple image, I now see a multiple image here in Pollock. Besides the animals, includes the head of a woman who's lying on her back. It's a little bit hard to see. Here's her eye, her nose, her mouth and chin upright, her chest swelling, and she holds her hand on the side of her chest, holds her fingers up. So it seems that, to me anyway, that the influence of Dalí shows his impact in New York on quite a wide range, if we think of the symbolic meaning of Joseph Cornell and his surrealist poetic objects versus Pollock with this overlapping energy of the human and animal. And that, I think, finds Dalí has successfully placed himself as the face of surrealism in New York City. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for these 3 fantastic brief communications on big questions in the history of surrealism. I think our appetite is whetted for some conversation. Maybe we'll start with, I'll throw some questions out and then we'll throw questions out to the audience. Maybe try to underline some of the topics that run through all 3 of the little talks that we just heard. I've been taking notes feverishly, and I thought I would start by throwing out the first one to Mark. So the Surrealist Map of the World, published in, I think, 1929 in Document, right? Yep. Came up in 2 papers, so that's we got to go there, right? So this is a map which is meant to change our sense of reality as we know it and to change our frame of reference. And it's about geography, which is why it's such a great choice for today's discussion. And we saw that around 1940 with World War II, you have a great phenomenon of internationalization of surrealism, right? But surrealism was already becoming global. So maybe we could say a little bit about how quickly did it actually escape the boundaries of Paris, right? Paris, yes, remains central, but it was not the only surrealist city for long, I think.
No, that's absolutely true. I mean, it depends on how you mean, because there was an influx of people to Paris already in the mid-20s. I mean, very early on, the word of surrealism was spreading, and people were coming to meet these folks and, you know, sort of exchange ideas with them, and then bring the word back to where they came from. You know, you had a number of, like Magritte from Belgium, from Brussels, a number of the Belgians. There was, in fact, a very important Belgian surrealist center movement in Brussels. There was an important one in London. There was an important one in Prague. So, you know, from the late 20s to the mid 30s, you saw a real flowering of surrealism through a number of countries. And one of the things that I love about this map is that it's kind of based on who their friends were and who they liked, you know. So don't look for the United States, you won't find it. But, you know, and you might be a little surprised to see Germany taking such role here. But remember, this was 1929. You know, fascism hasn't really become that present in people's minds, at least outside of Germany at that point. What the Surrealists understood by Germany was Romanticism, of which they were great admirers. So that's why Germany and Austro-Hungary have a big role. But, you know, they were also huge admirers of Oceanic art, and you see Oceania there. Of Mexican art, you see Mexico there. So, you know, of Alaskan art, you see Alaska there. So it's, you know, it really is kind of the world as they would like to refashion it, in the same way that they tried to refashion the city by, you know, turning everything into a can of asparagus. This is how they would have refashioned the world if it had been, you know, their druthers. But you're right, Matthew, that the word of surrealism and the spirit of surrealism spread very quickly through a number of things, through ambassadorship, because not only did people come in, but some of the surrealists traveled and went out. In 1935, André Breton and Paul Éluard, who was one of the major surrealist poets, went to Prague on a major lecture tour, you know, and because of this, a number of their writings were translated into Czech, and they met a number of people. There were all these exchanges, so there were, you know, these sort of pockets of influence. Breton went to the Canary Islands, and there was a Spanish language surrealism magazine that generated out of that. Because of the London show in 1936, you know, there was an English language surrealism magazine. So these events and these moments sort of helped spread the word. And there's a wonderful two-page spread in the magazine Minotaur, which was an arts magazine that they kind of co-opted in the later 1930s, that shows basically the international reach of surrealism, and it's basically just this huge collage, or this huge wash of different magazines and publications in all these different languages throughout the world.
This is for anyone, because just to build on that, I've been struck, you know, through the process of working on the exhibition and thinking about it and pulling together works by artists coming from many different places, that sure, there are many avant-garde art groups in the 20th century that are international. Right? Dada itself emerged, I think, in 6 cities, and was the incubator for surrealism, for example. So that's not different. But it seems to me that surrealism had a global reach that was maybe even greater than many others of the main art movements of the time. And I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts about its not only its geographical reach, but its longevity in time, and how those things connect.
Well, I'll dive in. I mean, I think 2 reasons that I can immediately think of that. One, I think because surrealism was not an art movement. You know, surrealism was a philosophical movement. It was a movement of ideas, and so the arts, the writing, the films, the objects, like all these things that they produced were really in the service of these central ideas, which really had to do with liberation, which had to do with untapping one's potential, with, you know, with overcoming what they saw as just the, you know, the brain-deadening banality of European life in the 1920s, the 1930s, you know, and so all of the exhibitions, the paintings, the films, the objects, the manifestations, you know, the demonstrations that they did, all the things that they did to provoke and to shock. You know, these were all ways of kind of getting people out of that rut and kind of getting them to think in a different way. And that, I think, is something that adapts and changes over time to our particular reality, but the underlying spirit of liberation and revolt is still just as as valid, just as present as it was then. The other thing, I think, is that Dada sort of worked on, my own feeling, Dada worked on ephemera, ephemerality. It was kind of a quick shock. It was there for effect, and this is one of the reasons why Surrealism, or the future Surrealists, Breton, Aragon, Edouard, and Soupeau, and some of the others who became the founders of Surrealism in 1924, broke pretty quickly with Dada. It did start in Zurich, but by 1920, Breton had managed to entice Zara to come up to Paris, which didn't take a lot of enticing because he was, ready to spread the virus as much as he could. And for the first couple of years, the young French poets, were real acolytes. They participated very eagerly and very energetically in the Dada plays and the Dada performances and this and that. But within not that long a time, Breton and his friends began to feel like there was something it was becoming a one-trick pony. As long as you got people to throw steaks and rotten tomatoes at you, as far as Zara was concerned, that was great, that was fine enough. And Breton felt like maybe there's a little something more. And so you start seeing this overlap of things like their experiments with the sleep seances and experiments with automatic writing and things that would lead directly into Surrealism and the Manifesto of 24.
Thanks, Mark.
Can I
add
take up
something?
your
Yeah, go ahead.
question? Yeah, I think it is striking how long-lived Surrealism is, and we do have a International Society for the Study of Surrealism that's on to its about ninth annual conference, so it continues
That's the
today.
public service announcement part of the
Yeah, okay,
proceedings.
sorry. But I wonder if Surrealism, being a literary movement first, had something to do with it. And then my second thought, when Mark mentions the London Surrealist exhibition, there's in the later phase, and what extends Surrealism seems to be this kind of exchange, and the Prague group will show the Parisian Surrealist, and then the Parisian Surrealists will include the Prague artists in their next show, and so on. And it's kind of transport and travel of the works back and forth, and sometimes quite remote, at least across Europe, and then increasingly with the show of Mexico City that you showed in 1940, that there's that kind of the currency of exhibition exchange spreads it and deepens it, I think.
And
Go
I'd
ahead.
like to add something. Of course, I completely agree. It's not an art movement, it's a philosophical movement, which makes it much more appealing and complex as well. And to add to what you said that made it attractive to many countries, many artists, also it was the first movement that was so open for women. And that was very important. And also among their interest, also there was the interest in the occult and in magic. Of course, ancient cultures, but they were interested in tarot, in astrology, and everything around the occult, which was had been covered by the rationalism, especially in France and other countries. And that it's one of the reasons that it's also very popular today. And the young people are in the same situation in many ways historically as they were in this idea of revolt and rebellion against society and what's happening in the world. And they find an echo in Surrealism. That's why I think it's one of the reasons of the recent popularity of Surrealism.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that, when you look back at the sort of the moments, at least in the United States, when there have been these sort of upsurges in popular revolt, Surrealism always seems to be right there, 1968. Now, there's these moments when it's just right behind. And of course, the big moment of Surrealism in the streets was Paris in '68 with the student protests. And it was no coincidence that a lot of the graffiti on the walls were Surrealist slogans 40 years before.
Maybe we're more topical than we even knew when we started planning the show. Terry, I wanted to go back to something we were just saying. Mexico, there was lots of back and forth in the art world between Mexico, the US, and Europe for a long time, and Surrealism, in a way, was continuing an older story of international exchange between Mexico and the rest, and the world and Mexico. And it seems to me that there was a lot of back and forth in the Surrealist years between Mexico City and New York in both directions. And since Louis was talking about New York, I wondered if you wanted to fill in a little more on that question of the back and forth between those two cities.
Yes, absolutely. First, the reason that there were some of them in Mexico was because they were denied the visa to the United States
Okay, that's number
because
one.
of the affiliation to the Communist Party. Originally, everybody wanted to come with Breton to New York, so that was the plan. For instance, Remedios Varo and Benjamin Peret, they absolutely wanted to be, because of Peret's relationship with Breton, they wanted to be in New York. But he was already on the blacklist for, being a communist, and Mexico was very open to receive exiles from both the World War and the Spanish Civil War as well. So that's how this happened. And they wanted to see each other. So, for instance, Wolfgang Palen, he arrived to Mexico by the invitation of Frida Kahlo. When she exhibited in Paris, she became very close friends with Alice Raon, and she invited them to Mexico. So they originally planned, they were the first ones to leave. They already had this sentiment about what was coming with the war. And they bought a boat ticket to get to Mexico with a stopover in New York. And in New York, they found out about Alaska, the totems, and all these collections. And they decided to go to Alaska first and the British Columbia and settle in Mexico. But the final destination, the original destination, was also Mexico. But Palen realized he could do many things in New York as well. So, for instance, the Dean Journal was published in English, was edited by him, but it was distributed in New York more than in Mexico. And there was all these collaborations among artists that were based in New York as well. Even though he said goodbye to Breton in the first issue, he was trying to do a dissident surrealism, but there was always this connection. And they were exhibiting in Mexico and then in New York, sometimes in LA as well, but mostly between New York. Of course, Rivera and Kahlo had many links in New York for all the commissions for him, mostly, and then Frida's show at the Levy Gallery, and then artists from New York coming to Mexico. So there was always reasons to come and go, and of course the exhibitions in New York included the Mexican artists as well. So there was a very interesting back and forth.
I think the 20s and 30s also were a great period of interest generally for Mexican art in the U.S., a great vogue for Mexican art, and that must have been part of it also. It's a history that we've maybe forgotten, but it's clearly very important for the subject that we're talking about.
Well, absolutely,
Yeah.
and the big collections like Rockefeller
Yeah.
were based on Mexican art.
Mm-hmm. Louis, so Dalí, right? When I walk through the exhibition, people often ask me questions about Dalí and his function in the story of surrealism. He has a very complicated, I think, fascinating role, and I wonder if you could say a little more about his impact sort of beyond the limits of the art world. I mean, do you think he had such a high profile because he was in the vanguard of the spreading of surrealism from the highbrow to other aspects of the culture? And was that the beginning of something for surrealism more generally? In other words, expanding its profile from the fancy galleries to wider audiences?
Well, I think he, and also we have to think about Gala, encouraging that expansion. I would like to think that we have to remember that Dalí wasn't part of the original Surrealist group. He's there in art school in Spain when the Manifesto of Surrealism is issued in Paris. He comes to Paris 5 years after this group has formed. So I think he has something of a feeling like how far in, how important can I be in this pre-existing group? And when the opportunity of New York comes up, I think that makes a lot of sense for him to push that. What we were speaking of before, how much did Julian Levy play a role in his promotion? Something for further research in the Levy archives here at the Philadelphia Museum. But I think that I think Levy was, astute in terms of the salesmanship, and Dalí was very willing to put a lot of time and energy into, a department store window that he, I guess he got a fee, but he wouldn't make him rich, but it made him available to anybody walking by on Fifth Avenue. I mean, you didn't have to pay money to go into the museum or the sacred space. So I think he did have a bit of a eye for a popular appeal, and the World's Fair Pavilion, which we didn't have time for, that's just amazing. He spent months on that. It was in the amusement zone of the fair. It wasn't in the fine art part. So it was meant to be for, the average Joe, passing by to looking for entertainment and almost art as diversion. He was willing to project that or put energy into that.
So I think the story of New York really is also part of the story of the broadening of surrealism in a way that wouldn't maybe not have happened in Paris in the same way. And so what strikes me is how the reach of things just seems to expand and expand.
Well, I think, in Paris, first of all, they had the literary and philosophical underpinnings were there. First of all, it was the culture from which it sprang, so there was a kind of a natural, almost understanding of what that background was. But the writings were available. They were written in French, most of them, the sort of the seminal writings, and they were, as I was mentioning before, a lot of them were actually about Paris. So if you were a Parisian, there was already this kind of, natural connection, which is one reason that it became very difficult for surrealist writing or the other aspects of surrealism that are not the immediate visual art component to travel as readily and as easily, especially to New York. I think that it was one thing to be able to see the painting. You might not understand it, but it grabs you. You're looking at something that has an immediate visual impact. And then when you combine that with Dalí's natural showmanship and Gala's incredibly developed sense of promotion and, Julian Levy and the people who are sort of backing them, you have this kind of a creation of this kind of atmosphere, biosphere, where surrealism becomes that. And, when I think of what the typical synonyms for surrealist or surrealism are today, they're what people tend to normally see, when you just use it like, oh, that was a surreal conversation, or, oh my God, that was a surrealist party. It's kooky, it's quirky, it's unusual, it's, if you visualize that, it's basically Dalí's paintings. It's not Tanguy, it's not really Man Ray, it's Dalí. He's the one who captured that sense of what we think of viscerally as surrealism.
Well, he was a showman, he right, a consummate showman, and that sticks in the mind. Yeah. Julia, how are we doing?
We can go to Q&A, or we can chat for 5 more minutes.
Let's go to Q&A. We're hoping that there will be questions from the audience.
So I'll bring a microphone over. Actually, Destiny, if you wouldn't mind bringing a mic over, and we're waiting for mics for questions so that everyone can hear. Thank you.
Thank you for speaking. It was an amazing exhibition. Really learned a lot, and it was extraordinary works. My question was just, and perhaps this wasn't the case, but I was curious about how surrealism interacted with the natural sciences, especially physics and mathematicians who were understanding reality and rules that had sort of defined 19th century science for years, and it was breaking all the way up to essentially nuclear science. And I was curious if that was in conversation at all with surrealism, the physicists, the mathematicians who were engaged in that sort of work. Thank you.
Mathematics, probably not so much. I think there was certainly a flirtation with the natural sciences. First of all, Matthew has an entire room of the natural sciences as represented in surrealism, so there was very definitely an awareness. But even even their first magazine, The Surrealist Revolution, was was modeled after this magazine called Nature, which was a science magazine. And if you look at the layout, it's almost identical. They sort of did it not to make it look like, they were trying to get away from the whole Dada, the crazy typography and all the, sort of the free-forming stuff. This was a very sober-looking magazine because one of the aims was that Surrealism had a kind of a scientific import. And this goes back even before the launching of the movement itself. I mean, when Breton and Philippe Soupeau wrote what's considered to be the first Surrealist text, which was The Magnetic Fields in 1919, it was one of the first extended experiments in automatic writing, where the two of them would just sort of darken paper as fast as they could and then read it afterward. When that book was published in 1920 as a book, Breton sent it to Freud in Vienna because he really expected that Freud would recognize this, as he did, as a major step forward in the psychological sciences, and was very disappointed when Freud basically said, "It's really nice, but I kind of prefer more classical poetry. I don't know what you want."
So in a way, I would say, modern art and modern science in general is a huge topic because artists are alert to new developments in many spheres. But the Surrealists, with the Freud example, they were not interested in curing you, right? So they were not going to use Freud in an orthodox Freudian framework, but really to cut across and use Freud for their own purposes, which means that the relationship between Surrealism and science is actually more complicated and interesting than even what we were just saying implies, because it really is a kind of free improvisation on scientific themes very often.
I think I see a question here.
I just wanted to add something. It also varies much in the places and in the times, because if I use Mexico as an example, for instance, Palen, together with Gordon Oslo IV, with Roberto Mata, Esteban Frances, in 1939, before the war and the exile, they were very interested in quantum physics and the study of the fourth dimension, mostly from a book called De Tertium Organum by Peter Uspensky. And then in Mexico, they continued to explore that, and that was one of the main topics, the science, interrelationship of science, for the Dean Journal that circulated among Mexico and New York. And then also, after the atomic bomb, many of these artists were exploring and studying physics to understand the nature of the atom, and then that can be seen also in the way they were painting at the time. So there are so many, as Matthew said, it's really complex, and there's many examples, but there's always been an interest in the relationship with science.
Thank you all so much for putting this on. This has been really fascinating. I really enjoyed the presentation where you were talking about how they look to Mexican folklore and infuse that into the art. And I'm just curious because when I think of Surrealism, I think of Dalí or Frida Kahlo. So I'm curious, like, how were the French surreal paintings different? As you were talking about how in Mexico they really infused a lot of the local folklore. So I'm just curious as to the different places that Surrealism went, how the local and native culture impacted the art that they created.
Okay, I will talk about Mexico in particular, but the interest of the Surrealists in all these different cultures started in Paris with the museum, what was it called?
The anthropological museum, basically.
Exactly, where they could see an exhibition of oceanic art, African art, pre-Columbian art. So there was, even before they were able to travel, they had an interest in this. So when Breton goes to Mexico, he already knew about it. He had read about Mexico. Artaud had been 2 years before, and he came back with many stories about what he found in Mexico. And Breton started collecting also. He was an avid collector of all different objects from a diversity of cultures. So he started building a collection also in Mexico from even ancient art that at the time was not regulated to, export or take from the country, and also popular or folkloric art for his collection. And when he organized the Frida Kahlo exhibition in New York, it was not only Frida. The exhibition was called Mexique and included Frida Kahlo, photographies from Manuel Álvarez Bravo, and a lot of the works from his own collection that he brought from Mexico. So that's particularly for this. And the surrealists that were exiled, it was also a very interesting moment in the history of Mexico where there was finally funding from the government to do a lot of new excavations, and there was a big interest in this work. So the collecting of objects was very, very popular. So Rivera was collecting, then Miguel Covarrubias in Mexico, and then when Palen arrived, when Breton Travels, they start doing the same because they also had all the resources of how to find things locally.
In a way, their collecting looked like this map. In other words, they had certain points of interest, right? I would also say that something about the way the city works, Paris and New York and probably Mexico City also and other places were places where you could go comb around and find interesting things. It's where collecting happened. And that must be an important part of this big story of sort of cross-cultural mixing in terms of taste.
Yeah, and it was also, I mean, certainly in New York during the war, when a number of them, Breton and Ernst and Duchamp were all here, they would go to, there was this place called Julius Carlbach Gallery on 3rd Avenue in New York, and it was, he was like one of the few people that had these, what they were considered, sort of artifacts, right? But the Surrealists were almost the only clients. He would sort of drag the stuff out from the back room and, blow the dust off it, and they were just like avidly buying these things, but for nothing. But they had a real interest in it.
The Surrealists were good customers in certain establishments. Yeah.
All right, so we're going to take one more question, and that will be from our online audience.
Hello. We have a question from Carol Raviola, who asks, where can we see more Mexican surrealist works?
Well, you could get a ticket to Mexico City.
Well, that's a complex question because since Surrealism became so fashionable, a lot of the works that were in private collections in Mexico have changed hands. But there's, of course, Surrealist works mainly at the Modern Art Museum in Mexico City, and usually a lot in display. And it also has the biggest collection of works by Remedios Varo in the world. So that's a good source.
I would say that, we're, because of the work of people like Tere and others, the interest in this topic has been on the rise, and so also museums are more and more showing, including our museum is more and more showing its collections of modern Mexican art and within that of Mexican surrealism. So, it really goes with the important collections, right? So, Philadelphia, MoMA, the Art Institute of Chicago. There are places in elsewhere in the U.S. where there's strong interest, and of course Mexico also.
The Princeton University Art Museum has good works on view.
Princeton University, which just reopened, and we recommend everyone to go immediately from this auditorium to Princeton to check it out.
All right, well, thank you so much, Matthew, Tere, Louis, and Mark.
And thank you very much.
And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and thank you to the Barron family. Thanks, everyone.